Our next speaker is Ginny Daley, and she's going to talk about vegan feasts and oat milk battles in Christian food cultures. Let's find. Do you have a PowerPoint?
I do.
Can you point to it?
That one.
Vegan feasts.
Vegan feasts.
Labeled.
Yep.
Fabulous. There we go.
Brilliant. Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here speaking to you. I almost feel like I don't need to say very much because my research and Ellie's research overlaps so much. Ellie looked at the Abrahamic religions. I was specifically interested in Christianity, and the presentation I'm giving now is based on the master's research I did with Anglia Ruskin in sustainability. I don't think that Christianity has the best reputation when it comes to being able to separate culture from doctrine. And so I was interested in how UK churches are responding to sustainable food transitions. How are UK Christians finding things when they say, actually, I want to avoid meat, I'm going to become vegan. So I sent out a survey through Christian environmental groups primarily, and I had a smallish number of responses, 60, 70, but they were all people who were following a reduced meat diet, so they might be vegetarian, they might be vegan, but they might also just have limited their meat consumption. So I asked them questions about their motivations for following that diet. And again, there's significant overlap with what Ellie's done. And but I also asked them what the culture was like in their church, what their experiences were following that diet. I followed up 12 of these for interview. The the survey respondents were mixed across the denominations, but the interviewees were Anglicans or Catholics because that gave me two groups I could compare easily. Those are the two largest Christian denominations in our country. Now, I've left the statistics out of my slides. If you want all the stats details, you can talk to me later. I apologise because I used to be a maths teacher, and so there's a lot of graphs in my presentation. But you'll be pleased to know I did leave all the rest of the stats out. But I did try and let my respondents speak for themselves because I felt it was really important that their voices were heard. Oh. Right. So, what motivated Christians to adopt low-carbon diets? And this is where a huge overlap with Ellie. So you'll look at that and go, oh yeah, that looks familiar. So we can see that climate change, that's the big thing that they were concerned about. And, well, maybe that's because I recruited through environmental groups. Of course they were concerned about climate change. But also, animal welfare comes in quite highly. So if we switch to looking at the, extra slide, there we go. If we switch to looking at the mean values, we can see that biodiversity, animal welfare are really important to Christians who adopt low-carbon diets. And then also social justice, so concerns about how it affects the poor, how it affects people in the global south. Now, again, overlap with Ellie. So Christians related their... Thank you so much, Maria. Christians related their dietary choices, their choice to reduce meat, reduce their carbon impact to their faith. They said, we are caring for God's creation, stewardship again. We want to look after what God's made. But they were also deeply concerned for his creatures, how we treat his animals, and they were concerned for the poor of the earth. What does we eat? What impact does what we eat have on the poor? Now, these motivations weren't static. They changed over time. And that's not a new revelation. Various people across the years have gone, yeah, motivations aren't static. So you don't usually have one motivation and it doesn't stay the change. Other things add in. And then the other thing was that some participants felt that their dietary change was faith motivated. It was a natural outworking of their faith. So they'd looked at their faith, they'd looked at the scriptures, and they'd said, this is what I need to do. Whereas for other participants, that overlaps with various studies, but for example, that particular one by Daw, Durradi and Reaver on UK Catholics. But then for other participants, we've got a situation where it goes the other way around. Primarily, they started with an environmental concern. That might have just come from watching the news, from being part of environmental movements. And then they looked at their faith and went, changing my diet makes sense. And that's far more like the findings that Blanc had in their study of European Christians. Right, more graphs, I'm afraid. So, what motivated our Christians to adopt these lower carbon diets? Well, not what motivated. Where did these motivations come from? So again, we can see that local church teaching there, that is the smallest, the least important source of information. They aren't getting teaching on sustainability, on lifestyle changes in their local churches. Much more strongly were Christian books or literature, Christian organisations, talking to Christian friends, and of course secular organisations, media and people. I did find a weak positive correlation between the level of church environmental action and the influence of local church teaching on dietary change, but that was simply a correlation. I've got no causation, so I can't tell you whether these churches had really good teaching on the environment and lifestyle changes and why that's important to your faith, or whether it was simply a result of positive group norms around sustainable eating. So moving on to participants' experiences of following low-carbon diets within the church. Now, the types of food that were provided at church shared meals were, well, quite frankly, a sore point with many of my participants, and vegetarians and vegans in the audience will probably sympathise. So 72% of churches usually or always provided a vegetarian option. It's not bad, nearly 3/4, but that drops to 33% once you start looking at vegans. And I think what was sad was that for half of vegan respondents, they seldom or never had suitable food served for them. So they couldn't go to a shared meal and eat with everyone else because there was nothing for them to eat. And that was also true for a quarter of vegetarians. And we can hear their frustration in this quote here. Then the battle for oat milk that forms part of my title, that was mentioned by a third of my interviewees. They were like, why can't I have a non-dairy alternative with my after-service cup of tea? Now, provision was significantly better in more environmentally active churches. So where a church was environmentally active, then they were starting to think about sustainable diets, maybe not in a policy way, but in a practical way. We will provide for people that have decided to exclude dairy, for example. Another positive thing, I wasn't coughing until I started speaking. Okay, another positive thing was that some churches had chosen to serve meat-free meals almost as a matter of convenience, and that often happened at children's events where they wanted simple food that everyone can eat. However, that wasn't the norm. And where food was meat-free for environmental reasons, it was likely to be at an event that was focused solely on the environment or perhaps social justice, maybe a linked charity event or something. Now, again, overlap with what Ellie found, one of the major themes that came out of my interviews was a sense of isolation. And for some of my interviewees, they had been vegetarian since childhood, now in their 70s or even 80s. That is a long time of feeling isolated and unconnected and different from other members of their church communities. And so for some of them, they found that this isolation could lead to a conflict of values and changed behaviours when they were sharing meals. And these kinds of fitting in behaviours are well documented amongst secular groups and meat reducers. And I think one interview in particular, he abandoned his meat-free diet when he was working as a parish vicar simply because of the emotional expectations of his parishioners. Another key theme was negative attitudes, partly towards diet, but often just towards environmental issues in general amongst parishioners. So almost all of the interviews reported apathy and ignorance and conservatism within the church community. And then we see that in a reluctance of church members to consider any lifestyle changes. And that lines up with other secular research again, for example, Brock, Williams and Kemp. Now, the support that participants have felt, that they received for their diets was limited. And we can see on that graph it wasn't great. It was better in environmental churches. Sadly, in Catholic churches, the Catholic priests were the least likely to be supportive of alternative diets. A few interviewees talked about positive things, for positive support from their leaders, but it tended to be isolated individuals or outside of the church. Despite this, there were some positive shifts in attitudes, even though when progress was slow, people were starting to see shifts in the right direction. Right, I'm going to race through these, I'm sorry. Though the low levels of support were reflected in a lack of teaching on the environment, and a lot of interviewees felt that their churches did not prioritise creation care. And again, that matches with other research. So church leaders were seen as gatekeepers of the church culture. So their support was generally considered to be vital. And denominational messages just hadn't been filtering down, whether that's Laudato Si or the Anglican Fifth Mark of Mission. There was a lack of knowledge and vision amongst leaders. So bring it all together. Participants, they had strong personal norms that supported their faith, but there was significant apathy and conservatism within the church, which was perceived to be greater than in the general public. Meat reducers or avoiders were seen as an outgroup. They had little influence on the general group norms, and this led to them exhibiting fitting-in behaviours, complying with the general group norm under some circumstances. However, where there was a church that was taking strong action on the environment, that created a culture where dietary change or dietary difference was easier. And so local church leaders, they were seen as the gatekeepers of the church culture. They had the opportunity to lead change, but mostly they were missing it. And so it was felt that the church leaders needed visioning, training and equipping to fulfill that role. Thank you.
Thank you.